Good morning. Thank you so much again for joining me this week for Story Time with Joyce. We were in the middle of chapter 27, named Louie, and this is where Betty had applied to become a foster grandmother for the psychiatric hospital. And Louie was a little boy that didn't talk. He had seen his parents be killed, and he went inside himself and hasn't talked since. His brother was adopted out, but no one wants Louie. But Betty is working with him on a volunteer program as a grandmother, and she tells him stories. And we read last week, she told him some stories about her childhood, and he seemed really happy. So she went home happier than she's ever been. So let's continue reading and see what's happening here. So when Betty got off the bus the next morning and walked to the hospital, she noticed she had a spring in her step. She felt energized. As soon as she walked through the door, she heard, "Hi, Betty. Glad you decided to come back." It was Mr. Roberts. He had been waiting for her. "I really enjoyed sitting with Louie. He is such a sweet boy," Betty responded. "He really took a shine to you, Betty. This morning he wanted pancakes. Usually we can't get him to eat breakfast. However, this morning he ate all 3 big pancakes." "Did he put maple syrup on them?" Betty asked. "Yes, he did. Why?" "Well, I told him a story about how my dad used to drill the trunk of our red maples and drain the syrup out," Betty responded. Mr. Roberts smiled and said, "Betty, you made quite an impression on this little boy. He is in the day room waiting for you." Betty smiled back and walked into the day room. She saw Louie sitting by himself and walked over to him and said, "Good afternoon, Louie. It's still pretty nice outside. Would you like to go back to our bench?" Louie nodded yes. Betty started her conversation with, "I understand you had pancakes this morning with maple syrup on them." Louie smiled. "Did you put butter on them as well?" "Yes," Louie nodded. "When I was your age, there weren't stores where we lived. We lived in the hills surrounded by all those maple trees I told you about, so my mom would have to make our butter. Do you want to know how my mom made butter?" Betty asked. And Louie looked up at Betty, smiling, and nodded. "Okay then, first of all, we had to milk the cows. I hated milking the cows. I would have to sit on those really small stools, and half the time I would fall off." With that, Louie laughed. Betty continued, "Then once I got settled on the little stool, I would grab the udders and pull down on them." Louie looked up at her with a questioning look. "Oh, that's right. You wouldn't know what an udder was," Betty responded to Louie's questioning look. Then she continued, "The udders are the long things that hang down from the underside of the cow. I would pull on each udder, which are like fingers, until milk came out. It was hard work. Sometimes the cows would get mad and kick its feet or just plain be stubborn. After I got the milk, Mom would let it set for a while, and then after a day or so collecting milk, she would scoop off the cream. The cream is what settled on top. She would pour the cream in a tall wooden thing and put a stick in it and push it up and down for a long time. And this cream finally turned into butter. And it was the best tasting butter ever. So now every time you put butter on your pancakes, I want you to remember how the butter was made." Louie had been listening intently, and when she stopped talking, he looked like he wanted to say something, but of course he didn't. When their session ended that day, Betty felt down. She didn't realize how happy and content she was, and she felt telling her stories to Louie until their time ended. She said goodbye to Louie and walked to the bus stop. While waiting for the bus, she reflected on their time together. She also reminisced about her childhood, about her mom, who had passed away some time ago from influenza, and the little cabin they lived in. The bus came. Betty stepped up onto the bus, took her seat, sat back, and just relaxed into her memories until her stop. Again that night, she not only went to bed with a smile, she slept sounder than ever before. She was happy. Betty met Louie every day, even though she only had to meet with him during the week. she went with on the weekends also. She and Louie had become so close. Each time she came, he greeted her with a big hug, and the same when she left. Betty told Louie stories about her life growing up in the hills of Kentucky and about her brothers and sisters. Louie was actually participating in games at the hospital with the children for the first time. He laughed and had become more expressive, but still did not speak. Louie's brother had been placed with a foster family who wanted to adopt him. However, they weren't willing to take Louie. Betty was given this information and felt if only she could get him to talk, they may change their mind and give Louie a home too. She continued to work with him for 3 months. It was now midwinter, and their special bench was covered with snow most of the time. So they sat in the corner of the day room. Betty would bring hot chocolate in a thermos and homemade cookies. She came to know the history of the psychiatric medical facility called Dunning, which was very dark. Betty started to hear stories of the atrocities that had taken place in the years past. Children from poor families placed there to die. Once someone was declared insane, they were sent there and locked up. Beds were lined up like army barracks, and hygiene was poor, and the food was not sufficient for the number of children that were there. Everything about Dunning disturbed her, and she was determined to see Louie speak. She knew that was his only way out. Again, thank you so much for joining me. It's kind of getting exciting. I want to see what if Betty can get Louie to speak. So thanks again, and I'm going to post a link to my YouTube video page below, and if you would subscribe, next month I'm going to be starting a conversation once a week about my book, Deliberate Decisions. And it's a self-help book, and I will read it, but I'll discuss it with you and have some exercises with you, and you can interact with me on the YouTube channel as well. So again, if you would like Betty or Ruth or Carol, my 3 books, you can go to Amazon.com. They're all written by me, Joyce Bennett-Hall, or you can go to my website, JoyceBennettHall.com. Thanks again, and see you next week. Bye.